Good afternoon and welcome from Teatr Powszechny in Warsaw, where we will be beginning the fourth installment of Forum for the Future of Culture. This event was launched in 2016 with Culture Congress. Since then, been meeting our viewers and spectators every year to talk about the future of culture and society. This year's installment, which is exceptional, its motto is Solidarity and Care, and in coming days we will be discussing how these values can serve as the basis of a new society, a new form of culture. This installment, this year's festival, was programmed by 5 curators who are activists, social activists, and whom I will now ask to introduce themselves. Let me just say that my name is Justyna Samolińska, and I was involved in organizing this year's festival. Good afternoon, my name is Amel Mana. I'm a social activist associated with Syrena and the Student Anti-Fascist Committee. I'm responsible for the alternative state, that part which discusses ways of producing new narratives and looking for a future that would be based on the values of the forum, namely solidarity and care. Good afternoon, my name is Zuzanna Karcz. I'm a high school student. I'm an activist associated with the new wave of activism. I work for human rights, women's rights, and the rights of LGBTQ+ community, and I will be moderating a debate on education and the future of social movements involving young people and not only them. Hello, my name is Justyna Samolińska. I'm a member of the Workers' Initiative trade union, and I'm also an activist who's involved in a number of other issues like the other curators. I care about feminism and the rights of LGBT individuals. During this forum, I will be specializing in work, the issue of labor. Good afternoon, my name is Strzemińska, and I'm associated with the Syrena Collective. I work to ensure access to contraception and abortion. During this forum, I will be dealing with reproductive rights. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, my name is Janka Świerżewska. I am an activist, a social activist, and a climate activist. During the forum, I will be dealing with the climate crisis and what can be done about it. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you to the curators for organizing the forum this year. I regret that we can't see each other face to face. We always had a lot of attendees, friends, academics, and artists. Today we will be working online. I hope that we will be together over these next days. I want to thank European Cultural Foundation for sponsoring this forum, for providing us with a grant, and I want to thank the Batory Foundation for the financial support they've given us this year to organize the forum. I hope that even though this year's forum is more online, is a little more reduced in scope, it will be just as important as forums we had in the previous years. Today we have 2 events in store for you, 2 assemblies, as we call them. To begin with, I wanted to welcome Edwin Bendyk, who is a columnist with Polityka Weekly. He's the president of the Batory Foundation and a friend of our theater. He's been working with Forum for the Future of Culture and the Culture Congress since the start. Edwin will say a few words of introduction, a keynote which is called Solidarity or Barbarism. Then Zuzanna Karcz, one of our curators, will moderate a debate. Where does Solidarity 2.0 come from? A new school, new principles of participation, and a new generation. And now it's over to Edwin Bendyk. I hope everything's working. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks to the curators for defining this year's forum. It's a great honor for me to be a guest and an observer this year, and to be able to say a few words of introduction that I hope for most of the people watching us, for those who've chosen to follow this forum, who somehow found this title appealing, what I have to say will not be anything new. I just wanted to put some order into the concept of solidarity and care, the two mottos of this forum. Solidarity, care, and imagination. These were concepts that were referred to in the forums of the previous years. And we've spoken about hope, we've spoken about threats. In previous years, we also addressed the threat of the rise of fascism in everyday life. So there's quite a lot of ground that we've covered. We hope that we hope this year to address the dramatic experience of the previous year, the pandemic, that highlighted a number of questions: solidarity, care, solidarity, and hope. We had hoped that this would be a foundation for the reconstruction of civil society. But is this valid? And this leads me to the title of my presentation, Solidarity or Barbarism, which refers directly to Rosa Luxemburg's manifesto from 1915, Socialism or Barbarism. Rosa Luxemburg was a vocal critic of the policies that led to the outbreak of World War I, the policies also pursued by the Social Democrats, a party Rosa Luxemburg was a member of. The German Social Democrats supported war bonds in the German parliament, which made it possible for the war to break out. World War I ended in disaster, and also set in motion a series of events that led to a crisis, to another crisis, and the 1930s, which then culminated in World War II. Rosa Luxemburg criticized her fellow Social Democrats for having betrayed the principle of solidarity with the workers, cross-border solidarity, for having opted for nationalism, for ethnic and national solidarity. I do not intend to propose socialism as an alternative to capitalism. I just want to look back at this juncture from 100 years back and show what happens when certain warnings are not heeded. Because Rosa Luxemburg clearly said what escalation would lead to in a situation that she analyzed in terms of a critique of capitalism. A century ago, capitalism was undergoing a structural crisis, much as it is today. And she showed that if an alternative is not found to the social and economic model in place at the time, the crisis would come to a head, and this in World War I, with all its consequences. The question is, can we propose an alternative to the social and economic model that led to the crisis. The first crisis was the financial crisis of 2008. The second is the pandemic, because the pandemic is to a large extent the outcome of a social and economic development which led to an environmental crisis, which in turn led to an increase in the number of pathogens, which in an age of globalization act with the same global rationale, and which at this time led to the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is, can a way out of this crisis, can a post-pandemic world constructed only by way of another crisis, or can we provide an alternative based on a constitutive principle? I believe that we should do everything we can in order that the experience of the first days of the pandemic, when solidarity and care were very prominent, that this discourse be transformed into a constitutive principle, but it will not be easy, and I think we should begin by invoking several phenomena from history and the evolution of the concept of solidarity, which is invoked by everyone in public space from left to right. Usually this is done uncritically and unaware of the ambiguity. We have to remember that Simone Weil, after the experience of World War I and the rise in the wake of the rise of fascism and communism in the Soviet Union, was very suspicious of the concept of solidarity. She pointed out, highlighted its tribal aspect, saying that it was a solidarity directed against somebody, class solidarity against the class enemy, or national solidarity directed against the enemies of the nation. And Simone Weil rejected this version of solidarity, to which she opposed the concept of friendship as the guiding principle. These we should go back to Simone Weil and also remember that a proposal that would free solidarity from this ambiguity was also, it wasn't the only one, but this one was best, I believe, articulated. It was proposed by Léon Bourgeois, his philosophy of social solidarism, as an alternative to liberalism, which at the end of the 19th century transformed into an egoistic individualism as the principle governing the existence of individuals in society. And Bourgeois proposed a philosophy of social solidarism based on the principle of solidarity. In the context of the pandemic, it might be interesting to say that Bourgeois was inspired by reading Louis Pasteur, who studied infectious diseases and the way they spread. So Pasteur's discoveries led Bourgeois to have a revelation on the way society works. He realized that society is made up of individuals, free individuals, who are codependent, dependent on one another, free not in a free monad sense, but people who are codependent on one another, also in terms of, for instance, their sanitary safety, because individualism ends when a pathogen is released into the environment. So these observations led Bourgeois to propose a social philosophy that became an important element of the social program of the Third Republic in France, after various revisions and certain socialist turns, but it was an important element of shaping a social order based on the principle of solidarity. I'll be going back to solidarity in a moment, but what mattered to Bourgeois, what was crucial in his lecture on solidarity, he said that people become themselves through society. They are not individuals in and of themselves, but they are shaped in the process of socialization and incur a debt to society that ought to be redeemed through acts of solidarity. That was his vision, and now I don't want to recall, or I don't want this vision to be the basis of the reconstruction of society after the pandemic. I just want to say that certain inspirations, certain thoughts can lead to ideas on how to create a new system. Now let's consider what solidarity is and what it isn't. I'm sure many of you remember the famous definition given by John Paul II, which was repeated by Józef Tischner in the Ethics of Solidarity. But a sociologist, Piotr Sztampka, calls solidarity a moral relation that he includes in the group of 6 basic moral relations that comprise a moral space, an interpersonal space that makes us together as individuals capable of creating something we call society and to lead a social life, to act together to a common purpose. The other moral relations, as Sztampka defines them, are trust, loyalty, reciprocity, respect, and equity or justice. Solidarity stands out because it is an act relation, whereas trust is an act of faith, for instance. It's an attitude, but solidarity it doesn't matter as a declaration, it only matters in action. Acts of solidarity matter, whereas declarations of solidarity less so, because solidarity is not an attitude, it is a practice, and that's what makes it especially important. These principles, these moral relations in normal times, in times when we are safe, when life goes smoothly, this is a backdrop that we don't give much thought to, but only in times of crisis. They come to the foreground. And we realize to what extent these relations are valid, are in place, to what extent they create a social space. And a crisis like the pandemic is a time when we ask ourselves whether we still are a society or not. This space, this interpersonal and moral space, does it still exist? So it's worth thinking back to the first weeks of the pandemic a year ago. We asked ourselves, I organized weekly discussions with people like Professor Ewa Łętowska or Adam Bodnar, two commissioners of civil rights of the Republic of Poland, whether the pandemic would serve the virtue of solidarity, whether it would encourage us to share the burden, or whether it would lead to greater individualism and treating the crisis as an opportunity to to pillage resources and only to look after one's family or one's closest environment. So the outcome is not clear. I'm sure each of us, all of us, could give numerous examples of basic human solidarity, simple things like helping, simple but very important things like helping people with disabilities, the elderly, but also following the rules of the restrictions. In the name of solidarity, I remember talking to high school students and middle school students Teenagers from Cieszyn who said that they agree to the restrictions which were radical for teenagers because they've basically confined them to their homes. They said that they understood the need to follow the rules, even though the pandemic was less of a threat to them, but the pandemic was a threat to the elderly, to their grandparents' generations. So I suppose everybody can give such examples. However, in a more general social dimension, we remember systematic analyses after the first months of the pandemic that affluence of a society is not a factor determining how effectively, successfully it deals with the crisis. Affluent countries, just to mention the US or France, had problems, but much poorer communities who, however, practice solidarity as a construction, the Rojava community, the anarchist federalist community in Kurdistan, showed that social life can be organized to ensure the safety of citizens, even without massive infrastructure. Another example is New Zealand, which is a rich country, but Jacinda Ardern demonstrated that success in dealing with the pandemic can be achieved using the language of care and solidarity, and not military mobilization. Poland, as a country, as a state, is a counterexample, differs from what happened in New Zealand, and at the local community level, the pandemic was used as an excuse, as an opportunity for political hijinks. Using the pandemic for political ends, we remember what happened in relation to the presidential election, or October 22nd, with the ruling by the tribunal headed by Julia Przyłębska, taking advantage of the crisis to complete a project that it's hard to define, but one which we're still opposing, which we're still protesting against. We're protesting against exploiting the crisis to break up society, to divide society, forcing people to protest and fight for fundamental basic rights. So this divergence in the levels of solidarity between people and solidarity understood as a moral relation, as described by Professor Stompka, shows that in modern societies, this second social dimension is important, solidarity as a principle organizing a society, not as in question of direct relations, but through institutions that distribute solidarity and an institutional sharing the burden or division of the burden among people. And here, the pandemic has shown us how fundamental, how important things that we had repressed, not all of us certainly, but which were repressed in the mainstream, and something that was so the key workers, the role of key workers, very badly paid often, educators, teachers, healthcare workers, but also retail sector, the sanitation workers. All these workers functioned smoothly. All these services were continuously provided during the crisis, and we realized that it would be impossible to go on without them. Later, we realized in the later stages of the pandemic, we realized that we were being forced to ask ourselves how we construct society in times when the when the pandemic will continue to be a threat. The risk of shutting down entire sectors such as culture, such as numerous services and various sectors of the economy. These are elements that we will have to factor in, will have to take into account when thinking of development. People in the cultural sector, actors in theaters who can't perform because of the pandemic, and who suspend their activity, as a society, are we willing to make up these losses? Are we willing to compensate? Or do we believe that these services are not ultimately necessary? Our government, the government of our government, introduces successive restrictions and lockdowns without saying how the costs should be shared. This is a debate that we've been avoiding. It is an issue that will need addressing and will need to be revisited after the pandemic, the way we understand solidarity, the way we share the costs, share the burden of crises, not only among sectors but also among generations. How long will young people be ready to say what the young people, the teenagers in Cieszyn said a year ago? To what extent they'll be ready to give up part of their future without expecting or without getting equal sacrifices, equal dedication from other generations. The Forum for the Future of Culture actually addressed these issues before the crisis began. A lot of these things have been discussed, have been broached, and I'll be winding up soon. But this is a special moment. 2 days ago, I realized when reading a report by the British Academy, which is made up of academics in the social sciences and in the humanities from the UK. It's called the COVID decade, and it says that even when once we've dealt with the virus, once we've learned to live with the virus, only then will the consequences of the pandemic, the psychological consequences, the debts we've incurred, the educational deficit that young people will be affected by having been deprived of education. And all of this will, at least over the next decade, addressing these problems will have various consequences, emotional and not only, and other crises that we've placed on the back burner for a while: the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the environmental crisis. These will demand our attention. So the question is, what now? And now it's time to get back to the alternative that was proposed or defined a century ago by Rosa Luxemburg, an alternative that I've redefined as solidarity versus barbarism. We have a number of analyses showing that the crises starting from COVID, which will go on for, and the others which are lurking, which are also underway, but like the climate crisis or the environmental crisis that we've somewhat forgotten about, these should be the basis for solidarity and cooperation if we are to address them. However, we have analyses, studies showing that this can be a political wedge, that a divisive action causing polarization and a tribal solidarity which is directed against someone. It's enough to read what Polish politicians are saying, who are about the green modernization, for instance, who are using this to position themselves in a populist way against certain group. This requires political wisdom, and we need to remember what the wrong approach response to a crisis can lead to, namely World War I. It doesn't have to end this way, but the wrong answer will definitely not lead to good results and outcomes. Thank you very much, and I want to wish everyone a very fruitful forum. It's happening online, but I'm very happy that we are meeting together. Thank you very much, Edwin, for outlining this picture. This is something we will be talking about during these next few days, but today we're beginning the forum with a conversation about and involving the youngest generation, people who are just getting ready to take part in social life, a generation that has been sorely tried during the last year. So now I want to hand it over to Zuzanna Karcz, who will be moderating the debate on Solidarity 2.0, a new school, new principles of participation, and a new generation. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this debate. I will not be repeating the title. I'm happy to be here at the Forum for the Future of Culture. Allow me to introduce our guests and outline or define what we'll be talking about in this debate. Before I begin the debate, I want to encourage everyone to send in questions in the chat box. These are questions we will be answering at the end of our broadcast, our transmissions. So again, send in your questions and we'll address them. And now it's my honor to introduce Karolina Słowik, who's a journalist specializing in education and the younger generation. She writes for Gazeta Wyborcza daily. I want to welcome Marta Zagożdżon, who heads the ConTrust Communication agency. She's associated with the Women in Technology Poland Association and the co-founder of the first Polish study on the gender gap, and an expert of the Let's Solve IT program. Paweł Lęcki is a Polish teacher, educator. He writes about the absurdities of the Polish school system. And Maja Urbanek is a high school student from Cracow. She's associated with the new Wave of Activism, and she is a member of the board on education at the advisory council of the nationwide women's strike. My name is Zuzanna Karcz, and I will be sitting my final high school exam this year. Today we'll be talking about, actually our debate directly has to do with the protests that took place in October. After the Constitutional Tribunal passed its judgment, when the tribunal was passing its judgment, schools and universities were involved in distance learning. Many commentators said that protest in a pandemic was impossible, but they couldn't have been more wrong. A few days passed, and columnists and commentators were talking about the awakening of the young generation. What changed? Is the involvement of young people a storm, a tidal wave? Will it increase? Is there a place in school for solidarity? Can a school contribute to solidarity? Can schools promote, encourage activism? And is Poland ready for Solidarity 2.0? Before I ask general questions to all our participants, I want to ask questions. I want to ask Karolina Słowik. We've been hearing a lot about the rebellion of young people. Did the year 2020 change youth activism, or was it a continuation? I've been following, I've been looking closely at high school students for a few years now, and I have to say that the time of meek, docile students and over. I was meek and docile. I graduated high school in 2007, and I was the second year that had gone through middle school. And I also remember when then Education Minister Roman Giertych wanted to introduce school uniforms, and only Warsaw protested. In my native Jelenia Góra, we complained or we whispered in hallways, hoping or making sure that no teacher would hear us. But today, I'm thrilled by the younger generation. They believe that the minister should be an interlocutor. They believe that the minister should stand up for their rights. They're also calling on the Children's Rights Ombudsman to speak out. They write to the Prime Minister, the President, to address a number of issues. There was an environmental competition recently where the organizers failed to define clear criteria, saying what the winners would obtain, and so they wrote a letter to the Minister of Education. They also drew my attention to the subject, asking me to look into it. And these aren't just students from Warsaw, but also in Ostrołęka, Piotrków Trybunalski, Jelenia Góra, where I come from. So we're really swamped. We're getting a lot of messages from them. And it's truly a showcase, a demonstration of activism. Even given the difficult situation with distance learning, a lot of interesting initiatives have come up. A petition that had nearly 1 million signatures was I don't sit tests without getting tested, where students demanded that COVID tests be provided in schools before exams. Protesting fourth-year high school students also wrote to the minister, and in reply they heard that students will not say what exams should look like, which clearly incensed them. The question was is this a continuation? Is it a tidal wave, or is this something just happening now? Let me just remind you that Rainbow Fridays have been going on for 5 years now. The Youth Climate Strike, the Dead Statutes Society, that was established 3 years ago. I'm sure Maja will have more to say. The Women's Strike has a branch called Young Women for Young Women. There is a advisory board at the Women's Strike where school students give each other advice on exams and distance learning. So it is a generational change. It's a change, and I'd say that these people are disappointed that they have to stand up and fight for things that should be obvious, for human rights, for freedom. And this is borne out in the polls. Support for the women's strike. This is an Ipsos poll for Okopres done in December 2020. Showed that the women's strike is supported by 38% of respondents between 18 and 29, while the youth climate strike enjoys 17% support. So good things are happening, but for how long? And whether we won't disappoint them, disappoint their hope that there will be solidarity as described by Edwin Bendyk, that's a different question. Thank you very much for that answer. And now I want to ask Maja Urbanek, is activism something you have to grow into? What led you to want to be involved in human rights? I believe that it is a process that has to develop. At least this was the case with me and the activists I know. It takes time. First, there's this anger, there's this desire to change something, to stand up to injustice, to stand up or defend your friends, your colleagues. And I think the pandemic led me to activism on a greater scale, online and in the streets, because during the lockdown, I decided that I needed to do something. I can't be indifferent to what's going on around me. And I think that was the main reason I got involved. And the deeper I got involved, the more I got involved with activists, the more initiatives I found that interested me, that I wanted to take part in. And it all grew. I also notice, I see that there's a lot of people who want to change the world, and if you show them the way, if you reach out to them, then they can do great things. So I hope that this will continue, this will go on. But I think it's a process that everybody has to go through individually. Because, I mean, you have to grow into understanding how much your vote, how much you matter and what you can do. Okay, thank you very much. And following on what Maja said, this year at the Forum for the Future of Culture, we are talking a lot about solidarity. I want to ask Marta Zagożdżon about solidarity, empathy, where it comes from, and why relations and bonds, even in times of a pandemic, are so important. Where does solidarity come from? I think we're born with it. I think it comes from the family, school, preschool, in the playground, visiting your neighbors, whenever our relations are involved, because solidarity, for me, it's it's based on cooperation, co-creation, shared participation, shared responsibility, sharing things. So whenever we relate with another person, it doesn't matter how big the group is, because we are gregarious. Edwin mentioned tribalism, our tribal nature, but that's a place where solidarity can flourish, or so where solidarity is defined or sometimes not. Wherever we protest, we object. So whenever we object, whenever veto. Maja mentioned the importance of your voice, and solidarity has to come from inside, but it's also shaped by our parents, grandparents, neighbors, educators, the people around us. Does this matter in a pandemic? Edwin said also spoke about it, and looking at what's happened in Poland and around the world, the pandemic can be a catalyst for solidarity. Look at the initiative to save small business, like the cream rolls in a district of Warsaw, where somebody posted that a company is going bankrupt. Let's save them, or help people walk their dogs, help your neighbors. This was all amazing. And I think it's just the beginning, because we need bonds, we need trust, we need a sense of community, we need sharing, doing things together. And I think that there is strength in unity, and the more unity, the greater the strength.
Niestety forma zdalna zmusza mnie do tej zachowania tutaj kultury wypowiedzi, czy na pewno zakończyliśmy wypowiedź.
Thank you very much.
Do pedagoga, doświadczonego w tej materii.
Okay, I hope you're done for the time being, and now over to an educator who has experience in these things, Paweł Lęcki. What is solidarity in the school system? How is it manifest? Good afternoon. I think that the pandemic showed basic shortcomings in solidarity in the Polish educational system, and the way I understand solidarity is in line with what's been said already, because I think that solidarity is cooperation and empathy. That's the way I would define it. It has these two elements, and that's something we found missing, cooperation and empathy between teachers, students, school administration, the superintendent board, and the ministry. They all operated independently. Up until the pandemic, it was based on inertia, but then it all fell apart. So this lack of trust between all parts of the Polish educational system, an unnecessary ministry that didn't contribute anything other than issuing instructions and directives. So everybody was left to their own devices. They couldn't communicate. And the problems with distance learning, not to mention technical issues, had to do with lack of communication, lack of empathy, failure to understand the difficult situation we're in. And when I think about solidarity and cooperation in school, I think about solidarity between secondary and elementary schools. I think about in final exams for 8th graders and enrollment in secondary school. I also think about solidarity between universities and secondary schools. So when I hear that universities do not intend to lower their standards, to lower the bar for enrollment, this isn't exactly fortunate, because by the way, not every university does a good job with distance learning, and not every professor, teacher is good at it, no matter how great they are. So if something doesn't work, we can cooperate around that. I think about the solidarity of schools. Schools are, in a way, islands. They're isolated. They don't cooperate. They're afraid of saying that they have problems, admitting they have problems. And this solidarity and cooperation is something we're missing, so that's possibly why we can't communicate. And the teachers' strike that we had a while ago didn't really bring schools together to create a greater set of, and also cooperation between institutions and companies. The pandemic showed that if culture-organized institutions, which are now empty, and companies and schools, so this cooperation might somehow animate them, might revive all this, also in terms of substance, because it's no wonder. I mean, you can have classes held in a production company, in a manufacturing company. So this is one solution, one thing that you could do, and the pandemic is a great opportunity. I often speak about mediation between students, teaching young people to communicate, because in the pandemic, we've lost sight of our students. We see icons. Even if classes are being held, it's just icons. We don't know what's happening. But if the relations between students were better, even if they were practiced or taught in a process of mediation, it would be better. This also has to do with peer education, where young people teach one another. Maya said that teaching one another activism is one thing. This is not related to schools, although it is in a way, but also helping your peers, your fellow students study in class. There's also the solidarity between the students and teachers, a mutual understanding, because the misunderstandings and the barriers are on both sides. This is due to us not realizing what it is we want exactly, precisely. So about solidarity, on solidarity, there's also solidarity between society and the school system. I don't know, activists, journalists, teachers, or possibly people involved in education need to convince people that education is what matters most. And if we don't have social support, then it'll be difficult to change something because there are activists, there are people who are interested, but I will be a pessimist. These aren't so much exceptions, but there are few of them, and they don't have the force, that the clout that would enable activists to shape or define which way society is headed. They're only showing what is possible, but it doesn't really happen. Empathy is not a quiescence to everything. It's not touchy-feely. Empathy is a way of seeing the world through another person's eyes. And even if I disagree with that person, I'll see why they see things that way. Carolina mentioned these campaigns. I'm sorry, it was Marta who mentioned these campaigns to help companies. In one town, there was an ambulance that was out of service, that was given to Ukraine, and the residents, the response of residents was actually terrifying. There was hate, there was objection saying that the Polish health service shouldn't give Ukrainians ambulances, but we received new ambulances, and we donated an ambulance that was out of service as it is. So until empathy becomes more widespread, and as long as it's not just part of protests, it'll be difficult for us. So as Edwin Bendyk said, what happens once we've dealt with the pandemic? That's something we'll have to deal with. So in looking at things more critically, we realize that the pandemic is something that will eventually end. Okay, we'll see what the future brings, but I suppose the pandemic will one day come to an end. But I'm wondering whether the situation we're in, whether this is a time when we're being affected by emotions such as frustration, pandemic fatigue. Are these emotions, or will these emotions allow us to develop, to build a movement that's pro-democracy, pro-human rights in the form as we know it? And is this sustainable? Actually, we can stick to the same order unless somebody wants to answer first, but I suppose we can stick to this order. So shall we, will we stick to what has come up during the pandemic? Are these solutions good? Well, I'm still an optimist. I understand what Paweł's saying. I see where he's coming from when he says that parents don't understand that the well-being of teachers is in their vital interest, and school principals don't understand students who are involved in the dead statutes or the dead bylaws society for the past 3 years. But I think that this difficult experience with distance learning, obviously I have to make a caveat, make the reservation that distance learning taught those who had the ability, who were self-starters, who had the cultural capital, who had the tools, but it left behind those who do not have the cultural capital, who do not have the hardware, who don't have the equipment. So we shouldn't be speaking of an education gap, but rather of inequalities that are getting worse. That's a massive problem. It's the greatest problem facing the Polish education system. But I am an optimist when it comes to activism, because the question was, if I understood it correctly, so this low spirits and the isolation, the fatigue with distance learning and distance education, will it lead us to give up activism at some point and just give up? But I believe that those who've made progress, who had the opportunity to learn more, to grow in this time. They're still active, and I'm thinking about the brave young women involved in mental health for young persons. These are young women who've turned their own experience with depression and powerlessness into a source of strength. So thanks to the competition called Exempt from Theoretical Exams, they got together on Facebook, on Instagram, and started talking about mental health, saying that that depression is not embarrassing, is not shameful, that go out and jog is not exactly the best thing to say to somebody who's feeling down or depressed, who's grappling with depression. And there's more initiatives like this. There's a book, a forthcoming book by Justyna Samolińska, who's studying these things, who's following these developments. I believe that distance learning led kids to look for groups online and to cooperate at various levels that directly concerned them. I don't have any studies, I don't have any data I can quote to confirm this, but these are people who approach us, who tell us about their initiatives, and there's more of this. And again, I see this as grounds for optimism, but it's a question what will happen. As Edwin Bendyk said, it's a test for us, because this Young Women for Young Women, or Girls for Girls group, or this advisory board at the women's strike, this is a function of the position of the older generation. So if we if we believe that certain things are important, then we we bring in the younger generation. I think that we need solidarity between generations and some sort of momentum that will go beyond just 2 generations. So this is a challenge for the parents of these kids and for educators. But getting back to education, it's not that great. The present ministry is working to suppress, to nip these initiatives at the bud. There's a draft and a proposal by the current president to the effect that parents decide to keep NGOs out of schools. According to the president, there would need to be a referendum where each parent, and so if there's 500 students in a school, you'd need to have literally 1 million people agreeing to invite an NGO to do a workshop. Fortunately, this draft is in the freezer. Education Minister Czarnek is very actively trying to introduce his own content to make schools ideological. He wants to change school books, textbooks, which have been found to be consistent with the core curriculum, but nonetheless, the minister appointed a group of experts who will approve textbooks and introduce content like the encyclicals of John Paul II or other things that are more conservative. And the ministry does not see this as ideological. So the Law and Justice Party, which lost support, and I have data, 3 years ago, young people, let me just pull up, 34% of them supported the Law and Justice Party, but in 2020, only 16%. So they are losing support among young people, and they're very resolved to change this. So it's not just mental health, but that's a problem, but also politicians who want to shape the situation. Thank you very much, and let me just repeat the question so we can bear it in mind during the next part of our debate. Will the pandemic consolidate, reaffirm the way we see activism? Will we be able to create pro-democracy or pro-human rights movements? And Maja Urbanek, thank you very much. I've written down a couple of thoughts I had during the last 5 minutes, and there's quite a lot of that. I agree with what Karolina said when she pointed out that the pandemic brought out social inequality. And I know that group at the advisory board of the Women's Strike is trying to address that. They're trying to do something about children, young people who fall through the cracks. But when we're all in our homes and we have more time because we don't have to commute or travel to school, young people are beginning to rebel. They're being stirred. They're looking for ways of reaching out to their peers who are interested in similar topics, issues. There's the new wave of activism, which we've mentioned together with Zuzanna a couple of times already. And it's a great way to see, it's great to see young people supporting one another in micro-activism, which is very necessary, and it's very constructive. I learned a lot thanks to the micro-activities, and it's given me a lot of experience. And I think it creates a sense of looking for a place in society, and this cooperation between cities, between generations, as Karolina mentioned. There's a lot of activists, older activists, who've approached us, who've come to us proposing activities or debates, and it was very encouraging. So generally we're open to every initiative, every even small initiative that people want us to be involved in. Generally, I believe that what young people have to say is very important, and that's something a lot of people aren't willing to hear, but we have a lot to say as long as you're willing to listen. So we're using this energy, this anger, this refusal to accept things as they are, and we're turning that into activism. For instance, projects like Exempt from Theory, that's an initiative that shows young people how to manage projects, how to do projects together. And in the context of building, creating empathy and solidarity, all these initiatives are very important as a way for young people to grow. And I think it's not so bad when you look at our generation in a broader context, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of good work, and I hope things will stay that way. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Same question goes out to Marta Zagożdżon. Is what's being done today, can it shape activism in the future? It can, it must, and it should, full stop. I'm speaking about education as a system, although a lot has been said about that, but one thing I wanted to comment on is my experience working with TEDx Kids for people between the ages of 8 and 18. On March 20th, there was TEDx Kids, and the activism, the positive ideas I saw there were so encouraging that I truly and deeply believe that this will happen, that this activism will be constructive, that it will build things. I mean, not overnight, obviously, but I believe in what Ovid said. Dripping water hollows out stone, not through force, but persistence. At TEDx, people spoke about school being hazardous to your health. Bianca Nuolisa gave a presentation on Don't Call Me Murzyn. This is a young woman who was on the cover of Polish Vogue with a banner protesting about being discriminated against, how she doesn't approve of the term Murzyn, referring to black people. And her parents took her to an SOS children's village, and she couldn't communicate with those children. She didn't find a common ground. There was some kind of rejection, but only when they spoke about the reason for these barriers, they started having fun together. They started communicating. They understood how many of these mechanisms are ingrained, how many of them. Kira Suchobojczenko, an incredible young person who designed flying backpacks. A very young person, very powerful, and also menstrual poverty. These ideas of grassroots solidarity, social media solidarity, that often begins with a single post that spreads out through the country, Europe, or as with Kira, all across the world. Young people have the courage. Karolina Mensch spoke about being me. We were told to study. We were told that you're worth as much as the grades you get. But today people object, and young people don't agree to this. They don't agree to this rotten compromise. They don't accept homophobia and so on. You know all this. I'm very proud. I have a 5-year-old son, and I hope that he will also be able to say, I protest, I disagree, I object. This is something I'm trying to nurture in him. And the company I work with, or companies I work with, they have diversity and inclusion in their DNA. And it's not just for ideological reasons, because it creates value. And an example I like giving is that male IT specialists cannot design menstruation applications. It's something that affects women, so women should be involved. I'm involved in studying the gender gap, the differences between men and women in the very broad sense, not just pay differences in terms of salary. And it's incredible. We took a look by generation. We broke it down by generation, and we saw that the gender gap is getting more narrow, that certain things that were reserved for men are now non-gendered. So, and this also goes for activism, diversity, inclusivity, inclusion, courage, and just go and do it. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear that. It's very optimistic, and the same question goes to Paweł Lenski. I'll try to be optimistic as well, although I'm tempted, although I tend to be less of an optimist. But and in the Gdańsk region, I've worked with young organizations, young activists like Młoda Zaraza, Young Pests. I know a girl from an organization called Go for a Run. And also in central Poland, there's the group of great young people working for mental resilience, trying to deal with the problems around them. Many of them have been active before, like the Young Pests, but they've been active before the pandemic. What I wanted to say about something about the center. Schools are strange places where gifted students and problem students have a lot given to them, but there's students in the center who get C's, B's, sometimes an A. They don't have psychological problems, or we don't know if they do, because we don't really talk to them, because there's not a lot to talk about. They don't cause problems, I mean positive problems that force you to help them, or other problems where they have, for instance, problems at home and need some support. So why am I talking about this center, this middle? When I'm thinking about activism and things that will be sustainable, things that will be lasting, that's only when these activists and us teachers, I think we have a role to play here, but also journalists and other social activists need to convince this center to leave its shell, because it's sometimes difficult to break through that shell. And if they realize that they don't have to be frontline activists, they don't have to go to protests, because not everybody has to attend protests, but they can be interested, they can say something, they can say what they think, because speaking is not a privilege, it's a right. You have the right to say what you think. And this center would be a foundation and activism, everything happening, just like Marta said, it can't be done overnight, but in the long term, and it would make it possible, stability. I gave a lot of thought, I thought a lot about the popularity of young adult literature. We don't have an equivalent in Poland. In Poland it's youth literature, I don't know what that means, but I found out that during the pandemic, I assigned a book, and I said it should be 1984, and a 15-year-old student has to be accompanied by their parent to the library, because you can borrow books from an adult library only when you're 16 or older. So I didn't even realize that libraries segregate books. And again, young adult literature is a concept, is a term I like. My students were fascinated, were interested in dystopias like The Hunger Games or The Maze Runner. As an English, as a teacher, they wrote a lot of papers on that. So when I assigned 1984 or Brave New World, I wanted to show that this genre came from somewhere. It didn't come from nowhere. And the rebellion that we're seeing today, this not agreeing to have adults say what school should be, adults or the church, the domination of the church, which is very evident and also affects the older generation as well. So young people read these books, but they didn't really know what to do with it, because you can read about Katniss, but who's going to be Katniss from the Hunger Games? And these protests, these demonstrations, these protests by young people, but also initiatives, it's like putting into effect, so you don't have to take up a sword, you don't have to challenge General or President Snow, but you need to fight to get people interested in the climate, get people interested in intolerance, homophobia, racism. And these are moments when literature that, is popular and clearly resonates emotionally, and this is popular, it's positive, it's good, but we should still remember the center, the people who we don't notice. So, of course, we need to reach the people who've, again, fallen through the cracks of distance learning, but that risk existed before, and we had, even before we had a problem, one that we didn't really talk much about. To summarize, education keeps coming up in our discussions, because if teachers agree to everything the minister says, his ideas about 3D booklets with fetuses Genesis and referring to Genesis, or all the content, everything written by John Paul II. And if teachers don't say that that's not the way to go, it's not scientific, it's not corroborated by research, we have to somehow protest. And if parents also need to understand that the minister we have at the moment, isn't just window dressing, but he has an effect, he has an impact on children, because the parents should be involved. As young people, you're young people, I can try and show empathy, try and help you, but then I leave the classroom and I leave you at some point. But your parents are with the children, so if parents agree to have a minister who's not doing anything good for young people and on the contrary is doing a lot of bad things, they should feel, parents, socially obligated to say enough at some point, because solidarity between generations should be saying that we're all generations say enough, speaking with one voice, and only then do you have is there a chance to have change. That's true, because it's not about rebellion, it's about stating your needs, clearly saying what you want. It's about the need for respect.
Bardzo dziękuję. Jeżeli w ogóle będzie dochodziło do interakcji, to jak najbardziej.
Thank you very much. And so let's interact with one another. By all means. We have a question from somebody watching us on Facebook. And let me just say that we will try and answer our questions at the end of this session. But again, broaching the subject of school, you mentioned students who are in the middle, somehow average students, but should we expect schools to encourage solidarity? Because, and on a personal note, in my activism, I believe in anti-discriminatory civic and climate education. I think that this is something that ought to be taught in school, but without this education, without this content, now that we have a government that's also so activism is actually developing even without school. So do we need a school that promotes, that teaches us about these issues, or should we leave it to activists? Should we keep it extracurricular? I'll be happy to try and answer the question. I think that school ought to perform this function. We have young people who are aware, whose parents are aware, who can find these answers, who can Google these answers, but they'll need to think of searching for answers, or they'll need to have a parent they can talk to. But then you have young people who don't have parents like that, who will never think of searching. So somebody should raise the issue, or at least mention it, and that, I think, ought to be a teacher. We have homeroom classes, as the minister says. We have family education, but we know the Ponton group of sexual educators, which are monitoring the situation, tell us what it looks like. We have teachers. I know from these great teachers what's going on. I know that these teachers are sometimes isolated. They're alone, and not every teacher is willing to raise these issues of their own accord. So if Minister Czarnek wants to teach books about the life begins at conception, and he wants to clamp down on Rainbow Fridays and all attempts at sexual education, then we have a problem, because there are kids who won't be able to find this on their own. Thank you very much. Over to Maja Urbanek. Yes, I agree with Zuzanna and Karolina because the system needs to be changed. I am in favor of anti-discrimination education for anti-discrimination, because that would create a society that's more aware of what's going on around it and of its possibilities, of how it can affect certain processes that are underway, or how they can affect what's going on in government. And this would be more comprehensive than searching for something online, because there's a lot of fake news. So if a curriculum updated to include the latest information from verified scientific sources, then we'd have a chance to have a society full of intelligent, wise people who know that they have a say, and that's what matters, because I don't like forcing anyone to speak out, but I also know that there are a lot of people who want to say something, but they don't know how to go about it, and I think that matters. And we need to train teachers. It's a dream of mine for teachers to take part in courses where they can also learn more, gain new knowledge, because the world is changing. We're discovering new things, and I think we should keep learning, lifelong learning, and nobody's infallible. And that's just a dream of mine. That's something I'd like to see changed in education, if it is to be more effective, and that's it. Thank you very much. Same question to Marta. Evolution is a process that's taking place, whether we like it or not. I don't want to live in a world of mediocrity, in a world of cliches, mindsets, stereotypes. We have 8 billion people in the world. All of them are different. So bringing it down to a common denominator is barbarity. You have that, as Edwin said, in business. When companies are recruiting, they have CVs without photographs or names, so that it's not gender, but competence and qualifications. In education, I want to help people develop their potential. No ideology or anything, no learning by rote, but teaching people to say what they think, to develop, to be innovative for the economy. So if we want to live in harmony and solidarity, but we also create value. But if we live in a state of mediocrity, it'll be difficult to go beyond that mediocrity. And I also agree with the need for everyone to keep learning, to keep growing. Thank you. And a question about anti-discriminatory education as part of the curriculum. Let me just comment on the solitude of teachers, on the isolation. I recently tried to count or see which teachers are not household names, perhaps not celebrities, but teachers who are experts in the media. Well, these are individuals. It's a handful of people, and it's always the same people, by the way. And the reason I'm saying this is that the social vision image of teachers is people who don't do much, who aren't really very successful. But the individuals who do speak out represent active teachers. But again, you lose sight of teachers who do a good job, who but who don't really stand out that much. And this might lead to the impression that in Poland you have a handful of great teachers and there's no one in between. No, and that's not true. As you said, what Maja said is true. You can't force anyone to speak, but you need to give them the sense that if they do want to have something, to say something, there's no risk involved. They can do so without fear. And teachers should say more about their work, what they do, what they agree, what they accept, and what they don't accept. Because education is not like just any other profession. It's a profession that trains you to work in all the other professions. So much depends on teachers, because they can lead to trust or mistrust of a professional group. And again, teachers are different. It all starts with teachers. Everybody goes to school, and everybody but then this leads to the impression that if you've been to school, you know you're an expert, but having taken part in something doesn't make us an expert in that thing. I feel that teachers should try to say more. There is this anxiety, fear that the superintendent board, that the minister might say something critical, that it's better to stay silent. But if we remain silent, maybe if we, talk among ourselves, but not a lot will change, because teachers attend a lot of courses. The question is, are these the right courses? And do they have a purpose? Some of them do develop us and do help us learn more in our field, but it's hard to imagine an anti-discrimination training for teachers. This would lead to protests by conservatives and organizations who will resent, or for instance, when journalists are trained in LGBT terminology, or in pronouns. So how can you do that? Because it's ideology. So sometimes we're left to our own devices. We need to learn all this ourselves. Some people are more involved because they read up on things. So schools shouldn't shy from difficult problems. I don't understand. Sometimes somebody once said that the job of a school is to teach and not to be a platform for exchanging opinions. I disagree, because schools are where you exchange opinions and learn things in the process. It's only natural. So schools cannot be apart from the world. Schools are part and parcel of the world in all its manifestations, and schools should address or talk about things that affect young people. So we are part of society. You can't have schools apart from society. That would be a misunderstanding. And as Karolina said, not everybody has the same access to knowledge. We only believe that everything's available online, and that's really good in terms of sex education, because it's enough for a teenager to switch on their computer and they can learn everything. But the sad thing is that they don't. Sometimes what they know is so bizarre that you wonder, how can people believe this in the 21st century? Because they opened a website, the wrong website, and nobody told them that there's no shame in asking. So they searched for themselves, and they found something absurd and stupid. So schools should accompany people. They shouldn't be maybe guides, because guides lead you in one direction, but they should be a companion who has the right to tell young people that they're doing something stupid. But people often accuse us of promoting stress-free education. That's not true. You can tell a young people when they're doing something stupid, but you can't be patronizing or condescending. But if you treat them as a partner and you tell them what you're doing is stupid, then they'll be willing to listen.
to koniec. Jeszcze nie koniec, bo jeszcze...
We're not done yet. We have a question from a viewer, Małgorzata Amelia Jędrzejczak, and her question is, how do you explain this generation change where young people are involved and not me? Let me just say that if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to send it in. I have a 3-year-old boy, so for the past 3 years I've been reading manuals on parenting, and I think that first of all there was a change in parents that needed to take place, and we realized that we didn't want to be me, that in middle age or earlier we're regaining our voice and we want to raise our children respecting their bodies, their choices, seeing them as a young person, somebody who's moved from place to place, dressed, undressed, fed. We realize that it's stressful, that it can lead to it explains why we have the terrible twos, for instance, and it doesn't help them be more independent. So parents of my generation have to read about it in books because they didn't learn about it at home. So we read, or moms like me read Jesper Juhl, and then see what we've done wrong in a given day. It's a method of trial and error. I think that parents older than me also tried new methods. These are the stress-free education, which has become a little infamous or criticized, but maybe we do want, in the spirit of Janusz Korczak, to give kids their rights, to give kids agency, the sense that they're in charge of their bodies, they make their own choices, and that's also where sex education comes from, being assertive, knowing how to say no, set up boundaries and respect other people's boundaries. Of course, I don't know the scope of it, but I think that this is a change that began with parents that first. Okay, thank you very much. In that case, let's just stick to the order we have. As someone who's young, as a rebellious young person, I have to say that I like thinking about it as I see it in terms of critical thinking. We've learned to do that. We've learned to stand up for our values and other people through empathy. And in this young generation, I think there's a sense of agency. We want to be involved in public debate since certain things will affect us in the future or possibly now. We ought to have a say. And this awareness, I think that access to media, internet access, has helped us develop this awareness, gain this knowledge, and to have views and take a position with respect to what's going on. I like thinking that there's a group of smart young people who are looking to change the world, who've decided to do it on their own, who've decided to contribute to the systemic change and force adults to do something, saying that we have a say, and if you don't listen to us, we'll shout until we're heard. So I'm glad that there are parents who also raise their children in this spirit of understanding and in a spirit of partnership, where they realize that the kids have their own opinion, have their beliefs, and they have the right to these beliefs. This, I think, leads to self-confidence. And that's it, I suppose. Definitely, we live in times where the world has no borders. There's a globalization. We can be here at one moment and then in another country, so it's only natural. We get a lot of information, a lot of stimuli, and if we don't have the awareness, if we can't assess, evaluate a situation, if we can't distinguish between right and wrong, we'll be lost in this world. It'll be difficult to understand certain things, and again, we'll be lost. So I think that empathy, solidarity, and the ability to be engaged in important things and not being meek is a precondition of a happy life. So ourselves and our children, we have to take what's good in the world. We need to look after the planet. So that's the way we have to be to enjoy life and live life to the full. So it all depends on what you learn when you're young. It's not something we were able to experience, but our kids will have that, hopefully. I think that it all began a little earlier. For the past 18 years, I've been working with young people, and I wouldn't say that young people today are different than the ones 18 years ago. They're similar, they're just as open, just as curious, just as smart, and all these qualities would be very similar. I hate it when people say that things used to be better and now they're worse. That's just ridiculous. It's stupid, and you have to be clueless to say that. But I think that it's getting more intense, this sense, this perception that the world isn't working anymore. And looking at parents, looking at the older generation that repeated cliches that really didn't lead anywhere, where nothing changes for the better. The world just kept consuming the number of commodities. It didn't make us feel any better, and in fact we felt worse. So we realized that the climate, the whole situation on the planet was about to fall apart, that the adults would die out and the young generation would be left there standing in the smog. And something that and they started externalizing, expressing all this, and coupled with the populist movements, coupled with the face of right-wing movements that want to tell you how to live, saying that any deviation from the norm is unacceptable. But young people said, what norm, what deviation? So what are you on about? And all these things combined and made young people more active, more dynamic. There's an analogy. We know the story of the ship that blocked the Suez Canal. It's standing there, and one ship stopped like 10% of world trade, and apparently this ship also traced a penis on the sea, never mind, and there's a small, tiny excavator trying to dig it out. But this excavator, I think we even have a bigger excavator that's trying to change the world, to move it in another direction. This is not something that'll be achieved in a year, 2 years, or even 10 years from now, if the pandemic goes on. But all the negligence that we had, not letting young people say what they have to say, just giving them a time slot on Saturday morning cartoons or programs for young people, teenagers. But now they're saying, why do we need a formatted time slot? We're part of social debate, we're part of the world, we have something to say. What we have to say is smart. And if what we're saying isn't smart, then just let us know. We can discuss it. So it's not stupid. Treat young people as equals. You have to realize that they have a lot of time to learn things, but sometimes, and some of us also began realizing that we don't know everything. And now these young people can see us as allies. This leads to resistance against the church, which claims to know everything, or political parties that claim to know everything. In the world today, you can't know everything, and anybody who says so is a liar. The world is full of doubt, but this doubt is creative, and it gives hope that there can be a change, that things can change. And young people give us hope that we won't lapse into the same cliches, the same ruts. What did we achieve? I mean, the world fell apart for a whole year, collapsed, and so maybe as adults we haven't achieved so much. A robot vacuum cleaner isn't really the standard by which to judge human achievement in the 21st century. That's not enough. Thank you very much. And I wouldn't be me. Okay, our 90 minutes are almost up, 90 minutes being the maximum attention span, and I don't want our debate to go over time, but this is one last question I've had from a viewer. Barbara wants to know how kids create solidarity in school, since for the past year they've been on Zoom. That's an important question for first graders, for kids who were bused to elementary school, who don't have a peer group in their immediate neighborhood. And the solidarity I spoke about before is, I think, for older students, kids who are fluent in social media, who can exist in nationwide or worldwide interest groups, but kids in elementary schools, in the lower grades, in Warsaw playgrounds. The playgrounds are fragmented in a way. Parents don't send their kids to the nearest school, so they have to bus or drive their kids to schools in another district or outside of Warsaw even. So that's a problem. We should maybe get back to your neighborhood playground and start working there, maybe some sort of soccer clubs. Recently, my son's kindergarten, my son's preschool had a visit from scouts or representatives from a junior league soccer team. Again, it's very difficult for younger kids.
To ja tak może skrótem
Just briefly,
się wypowiem, bo myślę, że tutaj
I think that Carolina said a lot of important things. I have an 8-year-old brother. There's a huge a difference between us in terms of contact with our peers. He tries to meet up with his friends, play games, or go to the park, but it's much more difficult than it is for me to call up or communicate with my friends using Messenger or other communicators. So we've learned to look for friends further away and to cast the net, I mean, more broadly, I think that younger kids will need to get used to, will need to find a way of keeping up relations with their friends. I don't know how that'll affect them. I'm not a sociologist, but I hope that it won't be too bad for them.
Dziękuję.
We run a kindergarten at home, in a way you could say. My child's friends visit them, and this is, I think for a 5-year-old, that's the kind of solidarity that they want, and I agree with what Karolina said. Teachers and kids in elementary school, they're all heroes, I'd say, because distance learning there is much more difficult than it is in secondary school. When I'm working with 15 or 17-year-olds, these are actually young adults, so it's different. So the way I see it is I'm a little tired of saying how distance learning doesn't work and how nothing works, because I think that things do work. If students see that a teacher is dedicated and committed, they're also willing to put in some dedication. So you need cooperation, and it won't work if young people don't want it to work. Regardless of psychological problems or problems with domestic violence, speaking of young people who can attend class, they have to believe that there's a point. But if we do the tasks, the assignment, that leads to something that has an effect, and that's important. Why am I speaking of this in the context of solidarity? And I really hate it when journalists write about lost generation. There's so many texts written about Maja and Zuzanna's generation being the lost generation because they've had distance learning, they don't know anything, and they'll never get into college. That's not true, because these people study just as hard, and you have to respect their efforts. I mean, there are people who have dropped out, that's very important, but you can't call them a lost generation either, because that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Words have impact. If you call someone a member of a lost generation, that's the way they feel, because you can say that, okay, the first or second classes in secondary school were given new guidelines. They feel like they've been subjected to an experiment, but as teachers, our job is to encourage solidarity. Students are scattered. I'm here. Even if I don't see all of them, I have to convince them that it's worth doing something, that despite the difficult and absurd circumstances we're all in, we have to do what we can. And that's an attempt to build solidarity. Because if I said, okay, there's no point, we'll never learn anything, you're all screwed, so there's no point, won't give us anything. But if we try and create a sense of safety, showing them that it makes sense, then in their own separate apartments, they will feel that they're together and they're working towards a common end, a common goal, an educational goal, which will translate into what, as Maja said, a social activism, where young people come together outside of the school environment, but they have to know that in school there's also a place for them, regardless of whether it's distance learning or on-site learning. This also, in adulthood, in business, we've spoken that there's no point. What's the point of doing anything? No, let's do something. Don't wait for people to give you something. Focus on what you can give. So that's solidarity, that I have a bit, you have a bit, and together we have a lot. So I totally disagree that it's not a lost generation. They have so many opportunities, and they're using them in a wonderful way. I won't let anybody dampen my enthusiasm. So as teachers, as educators, as parents, I really wanted to thank all the teachers like Paweł, who aren't afraid, who are willing to discuss these things, and so we need this common sense. And young people need that as well. If there are any other comments that you'd like to make at this time, then okay, but again,
dobra.
No, może rzeczywiście
dodam, let me just add that in our paper, we wrote a lot about the shortcomings, the disadvantages of distance learning. I live in the Praga district of Warsaw, and I watch kids in the neighborhood who are sitting in front of screens playing Minecraft. They've lost a lot. I think about them. In Warsaw, it was calculated that 600 kids dropped out, but so that's not a lot in terms of a 2 million city of 2 million. But the kids who are just playing video games, computer games. But I mean, I know the core curriculum isn't the only goal, but when I look at my young neighbors, I am a little concerned. We need to talk about, we need to think what to do with these inequalities and how to use distance learning tools to overcome these inequalities, because we are getting studies on best practice, on filling these gaps. We have research done around the world. We have best practice from the UK, Slovakia, and England, who've skipped exams. In Ireland, they don't talk about somebody being behind in their studies when somebody falls behind, so as not to discourage them. So we need to use this year to lessen the gap between the achievers and the underachievers. But I don't think that was actually the question, was it? Thank you very much. It's 7:53. I'll be wrapping up this discussion. Just let me know if there's anything you wanted to add. We're still online. And just to summarize and to add something, I think this might be the time for me to say something on a more personal note. This debate was the outcome of activism, as we've said already at the beginning, because the curators of Forum for the Forum of Culture this year are activists. And as an activist, but above all as a high school student, as somebody who will be graduating secondary school this year, 2 or 3 years ago, I never would have thought that someone would invite me to moderate a debate that's being organized by a large culture institution. But as an activist, I can speak not as an expert, although increasingly young people are being seen as young people representing these spokespersons for their generation. And this, I think, is very promising for the future, in terms of diversity and representation. So on this positive note, I wanted to end our discussion and thank all of you. It's been a great honor for me that we've managed to hold this very valuable, very worthwhile discussion, where we discussed statistics, processes, but also our personal comments and experience. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody watching, and enjoy the other events in this Forum for the Future of Culture. Thank you very much.